Let's go to the phone lines now. Sammy McIlroy, a former Manchester United player who would have played alongside Denis Law, joins us now. Sammy, really appreciate you calling. You would have played alongside Denis. We've been talking about that holy trinity of Best and Charlton and Denis Law. Just how good was Denis Law?
Absolutely fantastic. In the box, he was electrifying. He was brave. He could score goals that no other players could score. Overhead kicks, headed goals. He was just unbelievable goal scorer and a great man as well. I made my debut in place of Denis against Manchester City in 1971. Then I made my home debut the week after against Spurs and played alongside Denis, and it was a fantastic honour for me to play alongside such a fantastic man and great player.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about his character off the pitch, right? I mean, football nowadays, there's this massive disconnect, if you like, between players on the pitch and fans. Back then, obviously, players are so closely connected to fans. What kind of character was he like away from football?
Actually, you know, it's unbelievable to think. On the field, he would run into a brick wall. He would come up against men, defenders, 2-3 inches bigger than him, stronger than him, but he would fight them all. He was so brave. But yet off the field, he was very, very sharp. He had a great sense of humour, but he was completely different off the field what he was on. And but everyone will remember him on the field for Scotland, Manchester United, and obviously his early days as well at Manchester City.
And Sammy, in terms of his footballing ability, I'm watching a collection of goals that he scored here. It's elite level finishing, isn't it? How good was he? World
class. You know, the word, you know, two words, world class, are used very, very easy now. You know, they come out of people's mouths as if they're just talking, you know, everyday footballer or whatever. But this was a man who was world class. You know, you look at his goals. The overhead kicks he used to score, is the height he used to get up, the head balls into the net. He was always around the 6-yard box, always around the penalty area, and he knew where to be when the ball was coming into the box. And but he was also as well a nice footballer. You know, he could pass it. He knew where men were. He was just a complete player, complete striker. And there's not many at Denis Law's about, I'll tell you today.
Yeah, can I ask you, Sammy? You know that era that you were integral to. I find it such an amazing era of football. You know, when I hear about the stories of George Best, those amazing quotes that are just so synonymous with him and that era of football. What was it like playing them? What was it like playing in front of the Stretford End with such icons like Denis Law, Charlton, and of course George Best?
Well, I was lucky enough at 17-year-old to play with the three of them, all in the same team, and I was just in awe of every one of them. To watch them in training, what they did in training with the ball, how they prepared themselves for matches, how they played in matches. It was just electrifying for me to see what they did, and I learned so much off the three of them, and especially with Denis as a striker. You know, he used to say to me about, you know, where to be for like a second ball, and everything he was saying came off. It was so true with his experience. It was unbelievable. And as I said, to play with those three, Charlton, Law and Best, is I'll never forget.
Yeah, Sammy, you are obviously a lot younger than those three as well. What was it like coming through and being in the dressing room with those type of iconic players?
Well, exactly. I just sat there and listened. I was just overwhelmed by them. Their sense of humour was unbelievable, especially Denis. Denis was very, very quick-humoured. One-liners were unbelievable. And I just, as I say, I watched them in training. I watched them in the dressing room. I watched them how they put their kit on. I was just in awe of all three of them. And as I say, it was a pleasure. It was a pleasure to play with them.
And what was it like off the pitch? Because the stories are amazing, like the celebrations, the nights out. Obviously,
only tell us what you can tell us, Sammy. Only tell us what you can tell us.
No. Obviously, in those days, the social side of football was totally different to what it is today. I mean, in those days, the players could go out. They could be out and having a pint and talking to the fans and There was no people with mobile phones taking picture of you to see what you were doing. Everyone enjoyed themselves, and in the players' lounge as well after games with the opposition, there used to be some great banter, and the likes of Dennis and George were like the soul of the party. Those two, they were fantastic characters, and I learned a lot from them. And even on the social side as well, I learned a lot from them.
Sammy, really appreciate you coming on. Thank you very much. Sammy McIlroy played alongside Denis Law whilst at Manchester United. Alex Crook, our chief football correspondent, was on a bit earlier, and he spoke about Denis Law being the only Scottish footballer to ever win the Ballon d'Or. That was back in 1964. This is Denis Law talking about that achievement.
It was just unbelievable that you have. I mean, probably my favourite team in those particular days was Real Madrid. I thought they were the best team in the world, and they had people who got that Ballon d'Or, and to be walking along in the same as those people, it was incredible.
Wow, it's an incredible stat, isn't it? When you think of the players that Scotland have produced in the last sort of 50, 60 years. Again, we're talking about Kenny Dalglish. It's crazy that we were having this conversation earlier today.
We were talking about the greatest, if we were to do a great Scotland 11, we were talking about Ali McCoist, where he would rank. And you mentioned Denis Law. I was like, Kenny Dalglish, and you was like, Denis Law as well. I was like, of course, Denis Law. It's amazing that conversation was happening just an hour ago.
It is, but I guess this reiterates just how special he was. I mean, winning a Ballon d'Or. And you're talking, by the way, 1964, so you're talking all those special Brazilian players as well back then that would have been up for that award as well.
Well,
which
also, and you've got to remember that England won a World Cup just a couple of years later.
Yeah.
And yet it's Denis Law who wins a Ballon d'Or. It's a huge achievement because it was, the mid-60s was a great era for football, great era for producing iconic footballers. And yet it was Denis Law who was actually deemed to be the very best footballer in the world.
We are reacting to the sad news that Denis the King Law has sadly passed away after a long battle with illness at the age of 84. Former Manchester United and Scotland striker. Norman Gillier is a football writer who has written about Denis Law. He's also written about other footballing legends, including Bobby Charlton, Bobby Moore and George Best. Norman saw Denis Law become one of the best players of his era. And Norman joins talkSPORT now. Norman, really appreciate you coming on. Let's just talk about the great man, Denis Law, for a few moments. Again, you would have seen so many footballing legends, as I said at the top there, Bobby Charlton, Bobby Moore, George Best. What was Denis Law like?
Well, can I say, first off, what an irony that dear Denis has chosen today of all days to depart, because you probably know it's Muhammad Ali's 42nd, he was born in 1942 on this day. And Denis was a boxing fan, and he could have been called the greatest of his time as a footballer. So there's a link there between Muhammad Ali and Denis. And I'm so sad to hear the news, but to be honest, I've been expecting it for a couple of years now. The last time I spoke to Denis was about 3 years ago, and he struggled to remember who I was. But sometimes I forget who I am myself. So, bye. But Denis Law was, without question, the player with the quickest reactions of any footballer I've ever seen. He was always a thought and a deed against any defenders, and he specialised in what we called the hanging header. We'd never seen it before until he came down from Aberdeen. And there he was. He would go up for a header from, say, a set-piece corner, and he would manage somehow to hang there at least a full second longer than any other defender. And so by the time the ball came through, he was free to head it often into the net. He was the most intelligent of footballers. He always knew where to be and when to be there. And I would put him up there with Jimmy Greaves and George Best as the greatest British footballer I ever saw.
That's amazing. Can I ask you, Norman, to try and take us into the man that Denis Law was? Like, what was he like when you were working together? When you last spoke to him? When you were working together before he had his Alzheimer's?
First off, Denis like Jimmy Greaves, had the quickest wit of anybody you could wish to meet. He always had the quickest mind, and this was only not only on the pitch but off the pitch as well. He was always the one with the quick whip, and he used to use this speed of thought on the pitch, and he could always outthink, I would say, 99% of the defenders. And he always knew exactly how much weight to put on the ball for a pass. I mean, the great United team of the 60s with Best, Law and Charlton. Well, Dennis was the electric heel, we used to call him, because he was so fast and he could backheel the ball into the path of Best or Charlton and then whoosh, the ball be in the net. And it was all set up by Dennis's quick mind and quick action.
Yeah, very three different characters, weren't they, as well? You think of George Best, Bobby Charlton, the stories that we know about Bobby and Denis Law, very three different characters. What was he like? Again, you would have sat down and wrote the book with him. What was he like off the pitch?
Well, can I say, first of all, I knew George from when he was 16 years old, and when he first came down from Aberdeen to Huddersfield. Bill Shankly was his manager, and at the time, Dennis had a squint in his eye, and so you didn't know who he was looking at when he was talking to you. He had eye surgery, and then defenders didn't know where to look because they had no idea which way Dennis was going.
Yeah.
And, of course, in Shanks, he had a manager with a personality that was also electric. And so the pair of them together were fantastic. And I saw him play for Huddersfield against West Ham in 1956 at Upton Park. And I remember it was on an ice skating pitch. And Dennis was the only one who was able to keep his feet. And he scored a couple of goals and made two more. And Huddersfield beat West Ham 5-1 that night. And I knew then that this was the boy I had to watch. And then within about a year later, he was off to Italy, where he and Joe Baker were a couple of scoundrels together. And they played in Turin. And we talk about Dennis being different to George Best, but actually at the time, Dennis was the George Best in as much as he liked his life off the pitch as much as on it. And he was quite a drinker, and he and Joe Baker managed to turn over the Italian sports car in which they were driving the wrong way round a roundabout in Turin in I think it was 61. And both were very lucky to escape with only minor injuries.
Norman, I think of sort of modern day football, and anyone that's played for both Man City and Manchester United, you almost kill off one of your own teams, don't you? Like one set of fans or both set of fans are not going to like you. How was Dennis able to play for both, and yet both set of fans still hold him in such high regard?
I used to call Dennis the Scottish Cockney because he had what I would describe as a Cockney wit. And the fans really took to him. I mean, I don't think anywhere on any stadium where he played, he didn't get applause from not only the United fans but also from the home team, because there was something. I think the best word to use is likeable. There's something likeable about Dennis. I mean, he stood out, number one, because of his blonde hair, and also he introduced to football something we'd never seen before. As he scored a goal, he would punch the air like a gladiator, and a lot of players who followed him, like Alan Clark, Rodney Marsh, they copied that, where they would punch the air when they scored, and this was something that Dennis brought. He was an enormous personality as well as a great player.
Norman, we really appreciate you coming on. Thank you for giving us some time and sharing some moments there as well.
I wish it was better circumstances, but let's all remember that we saw a genius.
Indeed,
well done, Dennis.
Norman Giller there, who wrote about not just Denis Law, but about Bobby Charlton, Bobby Moore and George Best.
It's very true, the words that he just said at the end there. I think it is important to sometimes just feel privileged, as sad as today can be. Lots of people today will have witnessed Denis Law play football. They will be aware of the legend, and sometimes it's important to acknowledge and celebrate the genius that we were lucky enough to share a lifetime with.
Yeah, your texts are coming in. Keep those coming in. 81089. This one's coming. Sad news about the Lawman. Fantastic player and a lovely man off the pitch. I'm just too old to have watched him play live, but nice to hear from Sammy McIlroy, my first football hero growing up. I think meant too young to watch him play. This one's coming as well from Max in York. Says, too young to remember him as a footballer, but do as a pundit on Sky Sports. You could see his enthusiasm for the game and was always impartial. Rest in peace. This one has come in. So remember going to the Cliff as a kid for an autograph book, and Dennis would take his time to talk to you. It made you feel special when fans meant something. God bless Dennis the King. Kev in Eccles. All right, let's go to the phone lines as well. Phone lines are open, 03717 223344. If you want to have yours say on Denis Law. This one, Neil has called in. Neil, obviously, look, very, very sad news, but I always feel like in these times, let's remember the best times of Denis Law and just how fantastic he was on the pitch. And again, we think of the holy trinity of Denis Law and George Best and Bobby Charlton. And it was just such a fantastic time for football.
Yeah, it was. I was lucky enough to actually watch him play. I think the first time I saw him play, I was 10 years old. And I was absolutely in awe of how fast he was and how aggressive he was. As a kid, you know, you go your first football match and he stood out, and he's always been my hero since. I've met him a couple of times going back to the old days in the late 60s, early 70s. Players used to go training on a Friday at Old Trafford, and they'd all come out, Bobby Charlton, George Best, Matt Busby, and they'd all sign autographs. They had loads of time for people. But Dennis he's a proper gentleman, but he was an aggressive little bugger as well. I mean, I've seen him come to blows with the likes of Billy Bremner and Norman Hunter, and he wouldn't back down.
But you couldn't that era, could you? Like that, but like Billy Bremner in particular at Leeds United, it was. Can you imagine playing for Manchester United against Leeds United? It's like the War of the Roses. It would be a battle, wouldn't it? And you would have to have that edge in your characters to be as successful as Denis Law was, particularly in that era.
He never backed down. He stood up for himself, stood up for his teammates. I mean, I don't know if you've seen, there's a classic picture of him with his shirt ripped off, and that was a fight with Norman Hunter.
I'm looking at it right now, and that is an iconic photograph.
We've had so many texts come in about him just stopping for autographs and wanting to sign autographs for people. And I guess, look, football's a completely different beast now as it was then, right? I mean, players would stop and you'd be able to speak to them. You'd meet him in the pub. Completely different era.
It is. It's. I mean, like in those days, Alex Stepney used to have a pub in Stockport. And Bobby Charlton, George Best, Denis Law, Paddy Crerand, they were offered in there, and they were just normal punters. They were all about. They lived local.
And the crazy thing is, you are talking about absolute legends, absolute legends of the game. Like, not that I particularly want to, but you know, if I wanted to get, I wouldn't be able to get within 100 feet of Enzo Fernandez. Like, he's not a shadow of the player that these players were. These players were the very best, the cream of the crop, a Ballon d'Or winner, an absolute icon. And they're down your local pub. What an era, and what a time to be alive.
I still watch United now, and when the teams pull up, you can't get anywhere near them. You're very lucky if you get an autograph after the game.
Very lucky. Neil,
it's very sad, and it feels like, you know, in them days, I don't know what it is. It just feels like you lost a mate.
Yeah, I guess that's what it is to a lot of United, City, Torino fans, isn't it? Because, again, he was such a likeable character.
So relatable as well.
Yeah, we are taking your calls, 03717 223344, taking your texts as well, 81089. We are reacting to the sad news that Denis the King Law has sadly passed away after a long battle with illness. Welcome back to Thank Football. It's Friday. Adi Oladipo alongside Rory Jennings. We are reacting to the sad news, and that's of the passing of Denis the King Law, sadly passed away today at the age of 84, former Manchester United, Man City, Torino, Huddersfield Town forward, who won the Ballon d'Or as well. The only Scottish player to ever win the Ballon d'Or, won that in 1964. It's funny because you got the list up, didn't you, of who he was up against to win the Ballon d'Or.
Just to demonstrate quite how brilliant he must have been.
Give us some of the
names
if you've got.
Well, I mean, he finished clearly above Eusebio, above Jimmy Greaves, above Lev Yashin, above Bobby Moore. It's basically icon after icon after icon in this list for Ballon d'Or winner. And yet it's Denis Law that sits comfortably above it. By the way, in terms of the point system, in terms of that you have to accrue as many points as possible to finish top of the Ballon d'Or. Second was Luis Suarez, who was at the time playing for Inter Milan. 43 points. Denis Law, 61 points.
Well,
it was a landslide.
Landslide for Denis. The King Law, again, the only Scottish player to have ever won the Ballon d'Or. A man that would know that fact very well is someone that played with him for Scotland, and that's Willie Henderson, who joins us now. Willie, really appreciate you coming on, especially given the circumstances.
Yes.
Obviously, look, you would have played with him. You would have known him personally as well for many years.
Yes.
Obviously, this is really heartbreaking news for you right now. But what kind of character was he like? Before we talk about his footballing abilities, and we'll get to that, just in terms of a character off the pitch, what was he like?
Well, the thing about Denis was that what you saw is what you get. He was a genuine person. If he couldn't help you, he wouldn't say anything. And I was a young boy at the time, 18, 19-year-old, when I was playing in the Scotland team, and there was players like Denis Law in it, who was an enormous help to you, and always wanted to do his best for the Scotland jersey. He was a fantastic player for Manchester United, and he was a credit to the game called football.
Me and Rory a bit earlier, Willie, we were just having a chat about the best Scottish strikers. We're just a random chat earlier today whilst we're having lunch, and we was talking about King Kenny, and we was also talking about Denis Law. I mean, arguably, and look, there will be that debate, right, with him and Kenny Dalglish, but arguably Scotland's best ever forward.
Most certainly. Yes, arguably, they'll always be up there with the best players that's ever played for Scotland.
Mm-hmm. What was it, do you think, that made him so good on the pitch? Like, was it one particular attribute, or just an overall understanding and comprehension of the game?
Well, he was one of these players that, you know, we've all got something that's a strong point for us. But Denis's strong point, he could score with the head, he could score with the left foot, he could score with the right foot, he could tackle. He had the full picture.
And what was he like in terms of, you know, if the game back then, from my understanding at least, it was very robust. Denis Law wasn't known for his physicality. He was a fairly slight gentleman. How did he cope with the rigorous nature of football through the 60s and 70s?
Well, I think Denis was one of these guys that he didn't put it about, but he could certainly leave a message that if you want to mess him around,
understood.
He won't be long in coming back to you, you know.
Brilliant.
We always talk about the characters back then, just how different football was, right? In terms of that relationship between fans and players, something that obviously doesn't exist anymore, Willie, as you know. What was it like, his relationship with the fans? Was he one that would always stop and take an autograph and shake a hand, have a conversation?
Well, sometimes there were situations arose when you know, you're under a bit of pressure, and we're all the same, you're under a bit of pressure, but in general, Denis had always time for the fans. He had always time for the fans. They wanted an autograph, they wanted a picture. As long as there wasn't too much else going on, Denis would never let anybody down. I can't speak highly enough about Denis Law. I was a young boy, and he was good to me in the dressing room. He was good to me off the pitch when we were in training camps, etc. Yeah, and I got a terrible shock tonight when I heard this news.
So it is truly devastating news. And what about in terms of just like being a teammate, being around him, good company, good fun, somebody that was a joy to be around? Yeah,
the thing is, we're all different people, you know that, and you're in teams and all that, and you know that he could, without overdoing it, he was always welcoming to anybody. He would sit with them, talk to them, as long as the enemy wants was respected.
No, it's true. It's truly devastating to hear you speak so emotionally and articulately about this situation.
Listen, son, you know, I'm at a dinner tonight, and this is absolutely threw me upside down because, you know, such a good guy, and it's a sad loss for Scottish football. It's a sad loss for world football. That's how big a player he was. He was a world star in football.
Willie, honestly, can't thank you enough for coming on. Really appreciate it. Willie Henderson, who played alongside Denis Law for Scotland. Again, the sad news reaching us today is that Denis Law has passed away at the age of 84. Keep your texts coming in, 810 810. I'm going to read out a couple now. This one's coming from Lou. It says, I feel so lucky and privileged to have met Denis last year. He was such a lovely bloke. He had such an aura about him. People throw out legend quite easily nowadays. He truly was and will always be. And he's put up a photo there as well.
It's a lovely
Denis
picture,
Law.
yeah.
Any more coming?
Yeah, there's a couple here. There's been a vast array of texts that have come in. People have clearly been moved and are very emotional about this. As an 80-year-old, I'm so grateful to have watched the now heavenly forward line of Best, Charlton and Law. And that's from Barry, by the way. Barry's a Tottenham fan. So Barry's that shows you, doesn't it? That demonstrates exactly what this era of football was about.
Almost seems illegal, that forward line, doesn't it?
Yeah.
George Best, Bobby Charlton and Denis Law.
Yeah, no wonder it was so successful. But I think it does demonstrate quite how iconic it was and how it transcends sport and sporting rivalry, because that emotional message there from an 80-year-old Barry is a Tottenham fan.
Yeah, and I want to read out one more very quickly. Denis Law was the key to Scotland becoming unofficial European champions back in 1964 when they destroyed Spain at 6-2 at the Bernabeu. Again, that Scotland squad had so many fantastic players.
On AM, on DAB, via the talkSPORT app and on your smart speaker. talkSPORT.